Okay, in this video we're going to continue on to talk about some different types of receptors you find in the skin. So this will be part of the somatic sensory system, which is part of your general sensory systems. Now, uh, when we talk about receptors in the skin, we can really talk about them as being tactile receptors. And when we talk about tactile receptors, that refers to touch. Now, there's lots of tactile receptors in skin. In fact, these are some of the most numerous types of receptors. Now, we have mechanoreceptors, which are the tactile receptors, and these mechanoreceptors can respond to mechanical stimuli like touch, pressure, and vibration. Now, these receptors are located throughout skin, like in the dermis and subcutaneous tissue as well. And we've talked about these a little bit back in AMP1, but right now we'll go through some more detail on the two main types of tactile receptors. We have the unencapsulated varieties and the encapsulated varieties. Now, when they're unencapsulated, this means that the endings of these nerves, where the receptors would be, they're not wrapped in any connective tissue or glial cells. These are like free nerve endings. They're not encapsulated at all. They're a nerve ending with receptors on it. However, that differs from the encapsulated varieties because these endings are wrapped in like connective tissue or glial cells, which give them really an ending where we have like sort of this enlarged area near the end of the nerve that's more specialized at sensing or receiving different information. Now, for the unencapsulated types of receptors we find in skin, this can include things like the tactile discs, which is in the stratum basale of our epidermis. This also refers to the free nerve endings we find throughout the dermis and epidermis, as well as something called root hair plexus, which is associated with hair follicles throughout skin. Now, for the encapsulated varieties, we have things like tactile corpuscles, which are found in the papillary layer of dermis. We have end bulbs, which are found in the dermis, or bulbous corpuscles, which are found in the dermis, as well as something called lamellated corpuscles, which can be found in the dermis or the subcutaneous tissue, or hypodermis. Now, for the unencapsulated varieties, we have free nerve endings, root hair plexus, and tactile discs. Now, the free nerve endings are found mostly in the papillary layer of dermis and some deeper tissues. And these free nerve endings are necessary to sense things like pain and temperature. So we have special receptors on these free nerve endings that can be sensitive to temperature stimuli, so thermoreceptors, or even pain, which would be nociceptors. Now, root hair plexus you find surrounding hair follicles in skin, and these are also sensitive to things like temperature, pain, and vibration. And this differs from the tactile discs, also called the Merkel cells, which we talked about in AMP1. These tactile cells are basically specialized epithelial cells located in the stratum basale of the epidermis, and they respond to things like light touch on skin. Now, for the encapsulated variety, we have things like end bulbs, which are located in the mucosal membranes of your body, like nasal cavities, genital urinary cavities, and anal cavity. We have lamellated corpuscles, which are found in subcutaneous tissue, synovial membranes, and viscera. We have bulbous corpuscles, which are found in the dermis and subcutaneous tissue, and tactile corpuscles, which are found in dermal papilla, especially in those of the areas like lips, palms, eyelids, nipples, and genitals, because these are more involved with finer sensation of touch. Hence the lips, palms, eyelids, nipples, genitals, like more sensitive parts of your body. Now, we're going to first talk about these encapsulated receptor types. Unencapsulated. So for the unencapsulated variety, we have the free nerve endings, root hair plexus, and the Merkel cells right here, or tactile cells. Now, for the free nerve endings, these are basically just dendrites that have receptors for things like temperature and pain, but some can also detect a little bit of pressure. And you find these mostly in the papillary layer of dermis, as well as a little bit in the epidermis, and these are located throughout skin. Now, for the root hair plexus, you're going to find this around hair follicles, and these really have mechanoreceptors that are more sensitive to things like mechanical movement of the hair. This is going to be involved with knowing like if an insect is walking across your skin and causing your hair to bend. when your hair bends, it's going to activate this root hair plexus, which can provide your body with some information about, what your hair is touching or what is touching your hair. Now the tactile cells or Merkel cells, these are found in stratum basale of your epidermis or stratum germinativum. And these are really just like a specialized epithelial cell that, in response to light touch on skin, these are going to release basically neurotransmitter containing vesicles, which can activate nerve fibers that send action potentials to your brain so you can feel that light touch. And these are located throughout skin. Now for the encapsulated varieties, you can see that these look drastically different than the unencapsulated varieties. In fact, the ends of these encapsulated varieties have kind of specialized endings, which are made of either things like connective tissue or even glial cells, which help give these structures some more highly specialized functions. Now for the end bulbs, you're going to find these in places like dermis, mucous membranes of your oral cavity, nasal cavity, vagina, anal cavity. And really these end bulbs are involved with things like mechanoreceptors that can detect light pressure and low frequency vibration. So light pressure, because these things are located more superficially in skin, if you just lightly have pressure in your skin, that can activate an end bulb. These also are sensitive to low frequency vibration, so basically vibration at kind of lower frequencies. Now these lamellated corpuscles, also called Pacinian corpuscles, are located deeper in the dermis. Because they're located deeper in the dermis, these are going to be more sensitive to deep pressure and high frequency vibration, because deep pressure and high frequency vibration would be able to make it deeper into the dermis to activate these lamellated corpuscles. Now the bulbous corpuscles are found basically in the dermis, especially in joint capsules, and these are going to be necessary for sensing things like deep pressure and skin distortion. So when you think of a bulbous corpuscle, these are great for proprioception, which is for sensation of your limb position, like where your limbs are in space. If these can sense the stretch on your skin, then you can know maybe like the orientation of a particular limb based on that skin stretch. Now the tactile corpuscles are found in the papillary layer of dermis throughout your skin, and they're especially in higher concentrations in areas like your lips, palms, eyelids, nipples, and genitals. And because these are actually involved in touch, hence the name tactile corpuscle, these are really good at helping to undergo discriminative touch. So like being able to understand sort of texture of a particular object. That would activate the tactile corpuscle and help you understand like whether something was rough or smooth in texture. These are also involved with light touch. Now, that's it for the general senses, and the first special sense that we'll talk about is the gustatory system. And the gustatory system is your sensation of taste. And really, when you think of gustation, it's localized to the tongue and a little bit on the hard palate, on the roof of your mouth. Now, the specialized cells that help with taste or gustation are called gustatory cells, and you find these gustatory cells located within taste buds in the tongue, and these gustatory cells have taste receptors, which are sensitive to different types of chemical stimuli. Now, these taste buds are located on the dorsal surface of the tongue, which basically means the top surface of the tongue, and this is basically a specialized epithelial tissue that has these gustatory cells with taste receptors that can allow you to be sensitive to different types of chemical stimuli. Now, these gustatory cells are supported by something like a glial cell, which is called a supporting cell. And each gustatory cell in the tongue has a dendritic ending, okay, which have what are called gustatory microvilli or taste hair. Now, these gustatory microvilli extend, or taste hairs, they extend into the taste pore, which is located by your taste bud, and that allows for chemicals in saliva to diffuse down deep into the taste bud, enter your taste pore, and then basically have those chemicals bind to receptors on these gustatory microvilli, which can activate the gustatory cells, and allow you to sort of receive that information about the chemical environment in your mouth. So really what this looks like is, looking at the dorsal surface of the tongue, we can find different types of taste buds. So we'll have things like the filiform papilla, fungiform papilla, and foliate papilla, okay, as well as the valate papilla. Now each of these contains our taste buds, which line this little cleft here. And the taste buds are going to open up to a taste pore. So if we zoom in on one of these taste buds, look close, we find, okay, well here are our gustatory cells with our supporting cells nearby. These have our gustatory microvilli, or taste hairs, that open up into the taste pore, so that when saliva containing molecules basically moves down into the taste bud, chemicals in that saliva can activate receptors on these taste hairs and allow these gustatory cells to basically activate nerve fibers that go back to the brain and allow you to be conscious of taste. Now there's only 5 taste modalities, or basically taste sensations. And these 5 are sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and something called umami. Now umami is basically the Japanese word for savory or meaty, because umami is basically our sensation of a type of amino acid which you find in higher concentrations in foods that taste meaty. We call this glutamate. So foods that are high in glutamate have a lot of umami character or savory character, kind of a meatiness. So beyond meat, other foods that can taste sort of meaty would be things like mushrooms or tomatoes, which are high in glutamate. Now some restaurants or even foods have added glutamate in there in the form of monosodium glutamate, or MSG. It makes the food taste better, taste more savory, because it gives it more of an umami character. But monosodium glutamate, or MSG, can have negative effects on our physiology. Now bitter is a type of taste sensation that is typically associated with molecules that are toxins. Now, that's not to say that all bitter molecules are toxic, but many things that taste bitter in nature can be toxic to your body. And these are more like complex, basically organic molecules, so molecules containing carbon that activate certain receptor types and allow us to taste things that are bitter. And there are lots of foods that have a lot of sort of bitter molecules within them. Foods that taste sour are typically more acidic because our sensation of sour comes from a concentration of hydrogen ions, or basically more acidic solutions. So if you're eating a food that's more acidic, it's going to taste more sour because it has more hydrogen ions, hence the sour component. Foods that taste salty have more salt, like sodium and chloride. And that just allows us to be kind of aware of the salt content in our food. And obviously foods that taste sweet have a lot of simple sugars in there, like glucose and fructose, sucrose. And these are actually going to be sort of the sugars that allow us to taste things that are sweet. Now, in terms of the pathway of taste in our brain, what happens is that the anterior 2/3 of taste buds on our tongue are innervated or connected by the facial nerve, or cranial nerve number 7. The posterior 1/3 of taste buds in our tongue are innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve. So what that means is if someone has cranial nerve damage, they may lose a sensation of taste. And this is one of the assessments you want to look for when doing a neuro assessment for brain and nerve damage, is someone's ability to taste. Because if they lose their sensation of taste, that can indicate damage to maybe something like facial nerve or glossopharyngeal nerve. Now what's interesting is that if we go back to the slide, we see there's only 5 taste modalities: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami. But what about spicy? Now it turns out that our sensation of spicy is not a taste bud. In fact, spicy is actually due to the activation of nociceptive pain fibers in the mouth, because molecules that initiate spice actually are molecules that bind to the pain fibers in our mouth and make it taste hot or painful, or what we call spicy. So really, when you're talking about liking spicy food, you're talking about liking a moderate amount of pain in food. like myself. I love spicy food, so I guess I love a moderate amount of pain in my food. Now, this pain information is actually picked up by the trigeminal nerve, which has little branches that go all throughout the oral cavity. So when you think spicy, think pain fibers. It's not a taste modality. Now, in terms of the pathway that this information travels to, basically things like facial nerve and glossopharyngeal nerve will travel back to the nucleus solitarius in the brainstem, which will actually have axons that travel up to the thalamus, which then have axons that travel towards the gustatory cortex of our insula. So what that means then is that if someone loses their sensation of taste, it doesn't always indicate brain damage. It could indicate problems with the tongue itself or taste buds. It could indicate problems with propagation of action potentials back to the brain, but loss of sensation of taste can indicate brain damage through damage of these pathways that involve things like your brainstem, your thalamus, and the gustatory cortex of your insula. Now, what you see here, and one thing that's an important note, is that a large component of taste is not just the molecules that bind to our tongue, but also the molecules that enter our nasal cavity. Because it turns out that most taste is actually smell. We only have 5 taste modalities, but humans can smell, on average, 10,000 different odors. So what that means is that if we can only taste 5 different things, we can smell up to 10,000 different things. So most taste is actually smell. Now, our sensation of smell, or the special sense, is called olfaction. And our olfactory system involves basically nerve fibers that are located in the superior part of your nasal cavity that detect odorant molecules. Now, odorant molecules are basically chemicals that can bind to the receptors that we have in the superior part of our nasal cavity, and that's what can elicit an odor. There are lots of chemicals in the environment that we can't smell, but we can smell on average about 10 different types of odors. Now, what's interesting is that sometimes olfactory deficits are one of the first signs of dementia. So if someone starts to lose their ability to smell and they're elderly, if this is a change in the system, like if they already could smell and then all of a sudden they lost their sense of smell and there was no indication of trauma, that may indicate early onset of some sort of form of dementia like Alzheimer's disease. In fact, there's an interesting test out now called the peanut butter smell test, where if someone can't smell peanut butter, that is associated with Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't mean that if someone can't smell peanut butter, they have Alzheimer's, but it is associated with the onset of Alzheimer's later on in life. Now, in terms of our olfactory system, it involves something called the olfactory epithelium. Now remember, epithelial tissues cover and line spaces throughout the body, and the olfactory epithelium is the epithelial tissue that lines the superior part of your nasal cavity, and it's embedded with specialized types of cells, including things like olfactory receptor cells, supporting cells, and basal cells. Now, the basal cells are basically the stem cells that replace olfactory receptor cells and supporting cells, because about every 2 months or so, these olfactory receptor cells are damaged and replaced. Now, this olfactory epithelium is supported by a lamina propria, which is made of loose areolar connective tissue, and it basically helps nourish that olfactory epithelium. Now, these olfactory receptor cells are very similar to the gustatory cells of our tongue. However, what's different is these olfactory receptor cells have a lot larger variety of receptor types. Remember, up to 10,000 different types. So if we look at the olfactory system, basically at the superior part of the nasal cavity here, we have an olfactory epithelium. Now, if we zoom in on that olfactory epithelium, it's what we see over here. So this olfactory epithelium has things like mucus cells and olfactory sensory neurons, basal cells, and supporting cells. And in the superior part of the nasal cavity, we have a mucus layer. Now, the function of this mucus layer is that it traps odorant molecules in the mucus. Those odorant molecules then bind to receptors on the olfactory sensory neurons, which then can initiate action potentials to form in these olfactory sensory neurons. Now, what's important to note is that each olfactory sensory neuron expresses its own type of receptor, which is sensitive to a select variety of odorant molecules or chemicals. Now, because this olfactory epithelium is found in the nasal cavity and it's exposed to, potentially caustic environment like cold air, dry air, hot air, even bacteria, viruses, chemicals, this epithelium gets damaged quite a bit. So what helps replace and replenish this epithelium are the basal cells here, which are basically stem cells that can divide into new olfactory sensory neurons about every 2 months or so. Now, what's important to note is that these olfactory sensory neurons have axons that continue up deep through the connective tissue in the nasal cavity, through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, up into the olfactory bulb, which just sits right at the base of the brain. Now, we talked about the olfactory bulb as being cranial nerve number 1, which is kind of true. Technically, cranial nerve number 1, or the olfactory nerve, are basically all of the olfactory sensory neurons that connect to the olfactory bulb, but usually textbooks show the olfactory bulb as being cranial nerve number 1. There's a lot of additional processing that occurs in the olfactory bulb that allows us to help distinguish and differentiate sort of the finer nuances of a smell or odor. Now, what happens is that once the processing of that information occurs in the bulb, we have cells that send axons out towards the brain to basically the parts of our brain that are sensitive to olfactory information, like the learning and memory centers of our brain. Now, remember, the olfactory bulbs sit in the cribriform plate of our ethmoid bone, located just below the frontal lobes. Now, these olfactory tracts are what extend off of the olfactory bulb, and basically these olfactory tracts are big bundles of axons extending away from the bulb back towards the brain, where these axons connect to areas like your olfactory cortex, or your temporal lobe, or your hippocampus, or hypothalamus, and amygdala. So really what these axons extend to are the parts of your brain that allow you to be conscious of that odor, have a learning and memory component to the odor, because in the temporal lobe we have the hippocampus, okay, as well as sort of a homeostasis component, which involves things like your hypothalamus, as well as a emotional component, which would involve your amygdala, because we know that odors have usually a pretty strong memory component. They can elicit pretty strong reactions in your body, depending on whether it's a good or bad odor. And they can elicit very strong emotions as well, because they connect to the amygdala.